The Five Moons were Maria Tallchief, Marjorie Tallchief, Rosella Hightower, Yvonne Chateau, and Moslyn Larkin. All five of these women were famous principal dancers. When I was a young dancer, the iconic photos that we would find in the book to do our research were these five women. They pushed boundaries in what it meant to be a ballet dancer and who could be a ballet dancer.
Women in that time period were not at the forefront of companies. They weren't in the forefront of universities. They might have been teachers, but artistic directors definitely were not women. They essentially took ballet into the masses with their teaching throughout the United States and encouraged ballet to blossom and grow. And the fact that they pushed forward and persevered and became what they were is immense.
You know, it should come as no surprise to see natives want to participate in arts like ballet when you have an ancestral and cultural legacy that has always been expressed through dance. The Five Moons are one of not just Oklahoma's treasures, but treasures of Indian country. There are prima ballerinas that come from various tribes. We're very excited this year to be celebrating the life and career of Yvonne Chateau.
She was born to a Shawnee and French family, and the family moved to Veneta, Oklahoma, which was really kind of the nexus for where Shawnees were living at the time. That would have been around the time those Victrola record players with the big conical speakers were coming out, and so the family had one of those sitting in in the family living room with Grandpa and Dad putting records on a Victrola. That would have been where she first got her love of music and the arts.
Yvonne Chateau has been mentioning that dance was a prayer, and that is one of the culturalisms that Shawnees, Osages, and many other tribes, whenever we come together in ceremony and in traditional dances, that dance is a prayer in motion. And so I find her comment to be a very native idea on how you approach dance and how movement through space can be a prayer.
She started very young dancing in powwows, and then she learned ballet. And at one point in time, her dad wanted her to either be a ballet dancer or an opera singer, and she chose ballet.
She was the youngest dancer to join the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo at 14. What the Ballet Russe did internationally was potentially one of the most important parts of ballet history that we saw. They brought ballet to communities that had not seen ballet live before. Being able to have access to that kind of high-level training, that was a big ask for a 14-year-old, and she not only embraced it, but was very successful.
Yvonne's teacher, Danilova, was at the forefront of the teaching, and then Yvonne took it even a step further by starting a university program, which she and her husband was kind of unheard of at the time. And then they started the company, and the fact that she continued to bring herself forward and be in interviews and one of the predominant teachers, I don't know how else to describe it. It was just unique.
Her contributions manifested in the school of dances that are present, and ballet companies that we see perform in Tulsa and in Oklahoma City. I think we see it in the emphasis that OU puts on its school of dance. I think that emphasis lives on and will live on for generations beyond their individual lifetimes.
They were just so proud to be Native. They forged a path for young Native students in ballet, any art form, any industry. And the more that we can educate people about what these women did, the more opportunities we're just going to continue to create. So.
think every time we dance, we remember those folks that use dance as an expression. And I think as long as we dance, as long as we come together as a community, as long as we continue to participate in that cultural and ancestral legacy, we will continue to inspire other people to express themselves through dance.
Why? Why?
Hi, Holly. What an amazing video that was. Did you want to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Hi there, everybody. We wanted to share another version of Native Brilliance with you in dance, and we wanted to, in particular, honor Maria Tallchief. And Maria Tallchief was an Osage woman, literally tall. I was just telling our friends online that she was 2 inches taller than me, so she is 5'9" and a ballerina, and very well known in Osage country. And she passed away several years back, but she was a very famous native ballerina, another form of dance. And uh, ironically, the Barbie doll, Mattel company, developed a Maria Tallchief uh, Barbie doll, last year, and that's the picture in the red next to the coin. And she and the other four native ballerinas are featured in this Five Moons Dance Festival video. And the Tall Chief Mansion is in Fairfax, Oklahoma, which is where my sister has lived, in Fairfax, which is no street light town. And I just learned, I was just there actually, and it's kind of dilapidated now. But the Osage tribe just purchased it, and my understanding they're going to refurbish it back to its original glory and turn it into a cultural center. So we just want to share a different version of Native Brilliance, and know that we had fabulous native ballerinas. So thank you for that. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, Bernice.
Hi. So good morning, afternoon, wherever you're located. Welcome all my relations. I'm Bernice UP Jordan. I am a citizen of Fort Peck Sioux Nation, Public Health Program Manager at the Office of Tribal Public Health here at USET. Next slide. Just going to read a few audience participation tips. We are building a community. Please introduce yourself in the chat, select everyone, and let your fellow participants know your name, tribal nation, affiliation, job title, and organization. Important, we value your partnership. And most importantly, for our attendance records, we need accurate data. So if you're able, please change your name on your Zoom as well. Everyone will be muted until the audience feedback portion of the hour. During that segment, use the raise my hand icon on Zoom and the host will unmute you to offer your reflection. You will receive a recording and everything at the end of the Zoom. Continuing education information. This activity is jointly provided by United South and Eastern Tribes and Cardia Services. This activity has been planned and implemented in accordance with the accreditation requirements and policies of the California Medical Association through the joint partnership of Cardia and USET. Cardia is accredited by the CMA to provide continuing medical education for physicians. CARDIA designates this live web-based training for a maximum of 1 AMA PRA Category 1 credit. Next slide. Completing this activity. Upon successful completion of this activity, 1 contact hour will be awarded. Successful completion of this activity, of this continuing education activity includes the following: attending the entire CE activity, completing the online evaluation, available at the conclusion of the meeting in the chat, and within 2 weeks of the event. Submitting an online CE request within the 2 weeks of the event. Your certificate will be sent via email. If you have any questions about this, contact Haley Abila at habila@cardiaservices.org. Next slide. Disclosures. There are no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies for those involved with the ability to control the content of this activity. And before I hand it over to Evan, I will just go ahead and hand it back to Holly to introduce Dr. White.
Yeah, happy to. So again, we're in for a nice, wonderful treat today with our friend Dr. Evan White. He will introduce himself, but he's absentee Shawnee. He's a clinical psychologist. And my most favorite, he has a focus on neuroscience, brain science, and works to understand brain functioning and the impact of brain functioning on native risk and native resilience. And so we're really thrilled to have Dr. White with us, and another fabulous example of native brilliance. So, and he's from Oklahoma, not that I'm biased, but he's from Oklahoma, and we're really happy that he's going to join us today, and he'll introduce himself. And thank you all for putting your information in the chat. Special shout out to the UPIC people at Bristol Bay and our friends, Passamaquoddy friends in the state of Maine and California, North Dakota, Maryland, Michigan, Tuba City. You all are wonderful when you introduce yourself in the chat, because we like to recognize you. So I'll turn it over to Dr. White, and enjoy.
Yeah, Holly, thank you for that introduction. Hello everyone, Wisiki. I hope you're doing well today. Evan White Nitesito. My name is Evan White. As Holly mentioned, I'm Shawnee from Oklahoma, and I wanted to just share a little bit about who I am before we got started today, just to provide a little context for kind of where I come from and who I am. So on screen, there's a few pictures of some folks that are important to me. So on the left is my little family there, my son Benjamin and daughter Lois and my wife Natalie. In the center of the screen is the Shawnee chapter of the Native American Church of Oklahoma. And at one of our spring meetings, I think we were celebrating the birthdays of one of my, I guess in Shawnee relations, one of my grandson there on the left with his mom. And he's actually represents a lot of tribes, including the Osages there. But in any case, that's a kind of what I consider kind of my home base there at our ceremonial grounds in White Oak, Oklahoma, for our Native American Church of Oklahoma. Our stomp grounds for the tribe are not far from that location. And then there's a picture of me and my son at our annual green corn ceremony that we participated in with the Seneca Cayuga tribe of Oklahoma. We are getting ready for the Sundance there, and it's quite a bit different than the Plains tribe Sundance. It's different tribe, different way about it, but that's all the name of our Sundance, kind of celebrating the closing of our green corn ceremony. And there's also one in the springtime, and then that's coming up here pretty quick. And then lastly is a picture of our graduation ceremony with my PhD advisor and then the advisor for the American Indians into Psychology program at Oklahoma State University. So thank you all for letting me share a little bit about who I am, and we'll get going a little bit more with the topic for the day. And I present a little bit backwards in this regard. I like to provide the acknowledgments for the work up front so that as you're going through, I get the pleasure to be able to share with you about the work that I do and the communities that I partner with. But I like to point out that, even though I get to be the one here sharing this, it's a result of a lot of support that we receive here from the Laureate Institute for Brain Research, and yes, even still from the National Institute of Health. Even in current uncertain times, we've received, significant support and funding from the institutes and folks that at NIH. And then also, I really view this work as a culmination of the training that I received across the psychology program at Oklahoma State, specifically American Indians into Psychology and the Laboratory of Emotion and Psychophysiology. And then 2 fellowships I've been fortunate to be a part of through the Native Children's Research Exchange in Colorado and the Circle Center of Excellence at the Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Health have really kind of provided me a toolkit to be able to do the work that I'll be talking about today. And on a more personal note, I'd like to share this is kind of the team we have here at Lyra over the past few years that have really had a hand in contributing to this work. Various RAs and staff scientists and postdoc trainees that are really the kind of boots on the ground with me in our community engaged work, and some of our external collaborators through the Hopkins Center, and of course our community partners with the work I'll be presenting today are the Shawnee Tribe and Cherokee Nation. And so I'll present a little bit about the background. So how do we approach work within communities, and what does research look like whenever you're partnering with communities? Why is it even a priority that Native communities might want to be involved in? And how can we make sure that we're honoring tribal sovereignty through power sharing agreements whenever we work within research? And then more specifically about my work, I'll get to present some of the interesting findings that we are starting to see in our clinical cultural neuroscience work. And basically, this idea is how can we use advances in clinical and cultural neuroscience as a toolkit to help empower Native communities to find modern solutions to mental health difficulties that, again, are in service of tribal communities and sovereignty, rather than the other way around, which may have been the case in the past when it comes to certain types of research. And then I'll talk a little bit about kind of what we're doing now and where we're going with this type of work. So in starting to think about how research can serve communities, particularly our Native communities here in Oklahoma, I really rely on this kind of concept of regenerative research. And this is similar to the idea of regenerative agriculture, which is the idea that the process by which we go through our research leads to a feedback loop rather than maybe the typical scientific process, which is very linear and starts with maybe a hypothesis through data collection, analysis, and conclusion, a very definitive beginning and end point. I really view the type of research that we do within our Native communities as a cycle and that centers community perspectives. And so oftentimes in academia and science, researchers in the academic field come to a problem with a large preconceived notion of what the problems are and the kinds of things that might be a solution. But the way that we approach this work is to really think about ourselves as academicians or researchers as somebody with a specific type of knowledge and education and toolkit. So there's only a certain type of problem that me as a clinical psychologist that I would be able to inform or to help communities address. But the important thing for me is to engage with communities to understand, are these types of issues a priority? So some of the things that I consider myself well-versed in are mental health problems like anxiety and depression, trauma, suicide risk, substance use. And to the degree that tribes are engaged in efforts to mitigate those types of problems in their communities, I want to help find ways to use the training and education I have to create community-driven solutions to that. And so those perspectives help take this toolkit and develop research questions. And then as we're developing those research questions, it's a dialogue between community partners, whether those be behavioral health providers, tribal leaders, or in the picture that you see here, we have direct community members that were identified by the cultural department of the Shawnee tribe as people who are engaged in traditional culture, that have some knowledge of traditional cultural values and practices and things that might help us, one, guide the appropriateness of our research approaches, but also provide an in-depth community perspective on the kinds of problems and solutions we're interested in. And so that helps inform our research design and, importantly, the dissemination plan. Oftentimes, scientific dissemination just looks like a journal article that maybe somebody will read or cite in the academic community, but it's not always guaranteed that that information is going to go back to the communities where it comes from or get disseminated to the communities that it could be most beneficial to. So at the design phase, we also make plans for where are we going to share this information? How are we going to make sure that it honors the communities where it comes from and also benefits those individuals who've shared this information with us. And then, of course, we see the recruitment and data collection, the kind of standard processes of research. And then when we move to analysis, we also include community interpretation. So I provide, and my lab would provide, the technical expertise to analyze some of the more intense data. When we start to try to apply concepts to those data and interpret it, or what does it mean at the individual level, at the community level, our community partners are involved in that process, the meaning making of the research process. And then that informs our dissemination. And often that goes hand in hand with developing new perspectives and new questions. And so this is the kind of cycle that we are really trying to engage in when we approach these types of research questions. The next question may be, how do we ensure that even with this regenerative cycle, that we're honoring Native American sovereignty, American Indian health sovereignty in this? And so a first step is to make sure that we are going through proper data stewardship, not just ethical scientific approaches, but approaches that honor the tribal governance structures. So often tribes will have some process by which they approve research. And this may be fully developed research regulatory boards like an IRB, or it may end up being reviewed through their legislative processes or something in between. But ensuring that those formal structures are engaged with, make sure that there's an autonomy and authority coming from tribal partners that is on par with our other types of ethical regulatory structures. And then the second box there refers to the process that we were talking about in the last slide, which is aligning our research with community and cultural values. And then ensuring that we're building trust through providing shared decision-making and clear about the transparency, whether that's through funding, protocols, results, those types of things are fully transparent to community partners. And then last, ensuring that we have solutions to the substance use problems in this particular case that are led by community perspectives and culturally grounded, so that we're not just trying to take some substance use prevention or intervention protocol that was developed somewhere and force it into communities where it may not be appropriate or it may not fit the specific context. Now, to dig in a little bit more, I think of power sharing in the modern research sense. A lot of it has to do with funding and where is the money coming from and where is it going. And so there's a really thoughtful approach that we take to making sure that we're allocating budgets with community partners in mind, and whether that's and that's an open, transparent discussion, because sometimes it means making sure that we're funding individuals, but that we're not disrupting workflows with people who often wear multiple hats within kind of under-resourced tribal health systems. And so allocating those budgets thoughtfully is important. And then making sure that as we put in proposals that community members are included as investigators or PIs, or if there's not an individual that's identified, at least maybe subcontracting with a tribal facility or a tribal health system to make sure that we can facilitate capacity building within tribal infrastructure as much as possible as we're conducting this research. And then, of course, maintaining that transparent shared decision-making process, of course, is kind of the execution of the power sharing when it comes to the specific activities. And then the last is just a deep dive a bit here on the tribal IRBs. So oftentimes a research regulatory board will have a regular meeting structure, and this will be a formal structure that tribes may have that is the way that they operationalize their authority in research processes. However, it's important to know that some tribes don't have a defined IRB, and they have other research regulatory structures that they follow, or in some cases, the review happens all the way up at the legislative level of council or business council or even the chief's executive office in some cases. And this is important because what it does is it makes sure that the academic processes honor the tribal sovereignty and authority structures that exist for our tribes and put those on par with any other regulatory structures that we might engage with. All right, so that's kind of the operational background of how do we go about this work? How do we make sure that we're partnering in an appropriate fashion with tribal regulatory structures? Now we can dive deep into the science of, how are we using neuroscience to help benefit mental health and well-being, and particularly mitigate substance use in Native populations. And a lot of my inspiration comes from this, what we call a conceptual model here of stress coping, or the indigenous stress coping model that was published a little over 20 years ago, but I think is a really elegant description of how we can understand traditional culture and its role in buffering the impacts of stress. And in this case, it's really detailed out a specific type of stress that we label trauma. And that could be broad, as you see in the diagram, things that relate to historical trauma or discrimination, other types of traumatic life events. And then on the downstream impacts of those oftentimes can be health risks, substance use risk to our mental health. And what this model suggests is that our engagement as Native people in traditional culture helps provide a buffer between those things. It gives us a potential coping strategy, to label it specifically in this way, that may reduce our negative health outcomes from something like trauma or other forms of stressors. And specifically, my research is really interested in this arena. How does culture provide resilience against things like substance use, or promote positive mental health rather than just mitigating risk for these things? And the reason we bring tools like neuroscience to bear is because one of the things we don't know is, how does this happen? So these little arrows in this diagram, what's going on in there for individuals that is promoting health and well-being at, in my case, a brain functioning level. And so one of the tools that we use to study brain function is what's called an event-related potential. And this is electrical activity that we record directly from the brain. And this study I'm about to show talks about how an individual's engagement with their traditional spirituality may impact brain functioning in this very specific way. And so I want to walk through a little bit of details, and bear with me, it gets a little bit technical here, but I'm going to try to approach it in a way that everyone can understand, and that hopefully draws some connections between something like spirituality and mental health that we can measure at a brain level. And so this concept of an event-related potential really comes from these special neurons that you see in the yellow here on the left, called pyramidal neurons. And they exist all throughout your cortex in this really nicely organized kind of forest-like structure. And the cortex is that kind of lumpy piece of the brain that is on the surface that we all think about when you picture a brain. And the electrical activity that happens when those neurons fire, kind of at the tops of these little branches we call dendrites here, propagates through to our scalp. Because our blood and bone and all of that living tissue are electrically conductive, we can actually measure these subtle changes in electricity right on the surface of your scalp with just a, no more inconvenience than a goofy looking cap that you have to wear. And so what this looks like in practice is a squiggly line on a computer screen, or used to be chart paper. And this doesn't provide us that much information other than, well, we're recording some changes in electrical frequencies. But hopefully at any given time, your brain's doing a lot of things. It's responding to whatever you're looking at, but maybe it's also registering the fact that maybe I'm hungry. Maybe I should have eaten lunch before this presentation, or maybe this isn't the one I thought I registered for. This guy's kind of boring talking about brain stuff. I was hoping for more of the ballerina content or something. So your brain's doing all of that kind of stuff, and it's responding to things. So as a researcher, what we can do is give you a specific task. Like in this case, we might say, okay, we're looking at faces and we want you to recognize the emotions of these faces. And we can tell exactly when we put those faces on a computer screen. So we know, okay, we're only interested in this case, let's say just the neutral faces. So we're going to ignore the brain activity from any other time and just focus on every time you see that neutral face. Well, of course, you see that face and your brain's doing all those other things, registering the hunger, the boredom, whatever else it might be doing. Somebody's texting you and it's seeing the face. So the nice thing about random information in this case, anything that's not the face, when it's positive and negative like electricity, the average of any random set of positive and negative numbers is about 0. If you have enough positive and negative numbers and they're truly random, the average of those will be about 0. So that noise, we call it, or all the random information is averaged to about 0. And when we average these responses together, what we're left with is everything that was systematic, or those things that we're showing you over and over again. And we get this really nice, clean waveform that you see on screen here that we call an event-related potential. And those types of brain responses have been studied in the context of cognition and brain function for a little over 60 years now. So we have a lot of information about what makes these signals larger or smaller or faster or slower. And it tells us about how the brain's operating. So for example, the function we're going to be looking at is this largest waveform that you can see here. This is just an illustration, but what we call the P300, and it's a measure of attention. So you can just think about it. The more attention you're paying to something that pops into your awareness, the larger that signal gets. And why that's interesting is because we can do really boring video games, is what I like to refer to them as, or we call them cognitive tasks, that we ask you to do something on the computer and we can measure how your brain responds. And that tells us about how well or how difficult a task can be by just measuring your brain responses. And sometimes that gives us more information than even how your performance is, because there's more variability in your brain functioning sometimes than how well you're doing on screen. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail regarding the results. So here's actual brain data on the right here that I'm talking about. So if you recall talking about the P300, it's highlighted here in blue in these waveforms. And because of going back to the old school chart paper days, positive is down. I know it's kind of annoying, but it's a convention in the field that I've just had to learn to deal with, even though I don't really like it. But the point being here, if you focus on the panel on the right, what we're looking at is individuals that have anxiety versus individuals that don't, or healthy individuals. And what we've seen in the literature around anxiety is that folks that struggle with clinical anxiety oftentimes have to devote more attentional resources, more brain functioning in order to maintain performance. And so the nice thing about anxiety in terms of a concept is we've all experienced this. We've all worried about something or been anxious about something. And what you might notice as somebody who's dealt with anxiety is, sometimes it can be motivating to work a little bit harder or kind of or stay the course on a particular project until it gets done. And you can kind of think of that as this increase in effort. And so what happens is when we're looking at individuals with anxiety and trying to understand how this might be disruptive, oftentimes they're not performing any worse than individuals without anxiety. But if we look at the brain functioning, what we can see is there's a lot more neural effort that's going into their performance than healthy individuals. And you can see that here in the pink line where that P300 gets much larger relative to the dark blue line, which are the healthy individuals here. And you can see that reflected in these kind of what we call scalp maps, these kind of rough cartoons of heads on the bottom. The individuals in the generalized anxiety group have much larger signals than those without anxiety, which suggests kind of, you can think of it as the brain working harder. Now, what does that have to do with spirituality? So if you look over here to the left in these red and blue dots, what we see is that individuals with anxiety, represented by the red dots, as their spirituality scores get higher, that's the x-axis here along the bottom. So the self-reported engagement with their native spirituality gets higher as the graph moves to the right. What we see is that cognitive effort, represented on the y-axis, or the P300 amplitude, gets lower. It seems to be resolving towards a level that's closer to the level of healthy individuals. And when you look at the individuals that don't have an anxiety difficulty, in blue, there's really no relationship that's statistically significant between their spirituality and effort, meaning they're not really expending differential amount of efforts based on their spirituality levels. And so what this tells me as a scientist is that perhaps individuals who have an anxiety disorder who also engage in spirituality, their spirituality may actually help them function at a level that's healthier or more healthy with respect to cognitive effort than individuals who have lower levels of spirituality. And so I know we're getting close to the time on my portion here, but I also want to talk a little bit about not just how we're looking at brain functioning in other regards and how it relates to cultural elements, but more specifically, how does cultural information itself get processed in the brain? And this is a study that we've recently conducted and was actually recently published, where we developed what we call the AIM set, or the American Indian Multimedia Stimulus Set. And the idea here was to create a heterogeneous sample, so meaning represents a lot of different tribal backgrounds, and to see how do Native people from a variety of backgrounds connect with cultural information that's presented as pictures, audio, or video, and how does that impact brain functioning. And so we created this set, and of course there's some RAs here that were really pivotal in helping us develop this information. And we just pulled open source images and videos that were already publicly available. So we weren't engaging in any new media creation, but only using like already accessible media, whether that's pictures, videos, or audio. And we created comparison images. So as you can see here, these are the picture representations where we tried to capture the similar elements of the images, but just varying the cultural information. And we did this for 48 pictures. We also did this with music clips from traditional music and videos of prominent Native people, not unlike the video we watched at the beginning here, discussing Native identity and how it relates to individuals. And what we see, if you look in the red bars here, is individuals who are looking at cultural information, they're rating it as more engaging, a little bit more positive, but significantly more like here in this space. Let me see if I can actually change this really quick so I can get a better one here. So in this little graphic, what you're seeing is that they're rating this information, whether it's videos or pictures or music, as more related to their native identity, and also as a more typical of what native people might experience than the comparator pictures. And interestingly, what we can see is signatures in the brain when people are responding to pictures or music or videos. The cultural information is driving a different type of brain activity than the comparator information. Specifically, when we look at videos and audio, the more long dynamic processes, we're seeing more activation in what we call kind of the self-referential processing network, or you might hear referred to as a default mode network. So a higher activation in ventral medial prefrontal cortex and areas in the precuneus across both. And then in static pictures, the type of brain activity is quite a bit different, but the stimuli are quite a bit different. It's just a still picture. What we're seeing is down regulation in some of those cognitive effort functions. So when you're seeing people connect with the native pictures, we're seeing less activity in these kind of executive control, high effort brain regions. And if we look at the electrical activity, like we did from the last, what we're seeing is when we're looking at attention, so this is another ERP, you can see it's a lot longer and slower. We call it the late positive potential. And this electrical activity has been associated with emotional engagement and or what we call motivated attention. So when we see larger signals here, what we are in this context seeing is more attentional engagement, more emotional connection with the content on screen. And what we see is we do see a larger engagement with the cultural information demonstrated in red here than the comparator information or neutral information in the black line, which is really exciting to me because this is kind of, this type of research is the bread and butter of my training. And I was a little skeptical that we would be able to get this signal just from cultural information. It's been demonstrated in other areas of emotional science, and it can be a particularly difficult signal to modulate unless you have very engaging content. And so this just underscores how engaging cultural content is for Native people. And so our hope here is that we'll be able to use these sorts of brain functions to start to understand the specific ways that culture is beneficial for individuals and help us inform neuroscience informed, but also culturally relevant substance use and mental health interventions and preventions. And we have some other work on those types of things that I don't have time to share with today. But one of our future directions is to work specific tribal communities to make sure that this cultural content isn't just a broad concept, but is actually connected to a particular traditional set. And so we're doing this right now with the Shawnee tribe. We just started the third year of a project where the very first step was to gather Shawnee cultural knowledge keepers or knowledge bearers and have them define from their own perspectives, what is traditional cultural engagement for Shawnee people, but more importantly, how is it beneficial to your well-being and how might it help people recover from or stay away from substance use? And then based on those community definitions, we've developed a protocol and measurement of those cultural factors and cultural influences that we can then study in a typical neuroscience paradigm for individuals or eventually with individuals that have lived experience with substance use, so we can start to create these scientific models of how cultural engagement buffers against the brain functions and risks that are associated with substance use disorder. And so right now, we've completed that first phase of community-defined assessments of traditional cultural engagement. We're currently in phase 2, and of course, we're actually doing the alternative path here, which is really just instead of finding individuals to compare, we're looking at everyone in a more continuous fashion in terms of their engagement with traditional culture. And then this is about a 2-year process. We're right in the middle of it now. And then our next step will be to implement this more in a clinical sample. So Here, we're understanding the brain functioning associated with cultural engagement and how that relates to the brain functions that seem to be most relevant for substance use risk and recovery. And then we're going to take the information we learned from here and apply it in a more clinically focused fashion in the last steps. So hopefully that wasn't just too fast, but I also want to acknowledge the team that we're currently working with. So my lab here at the Neuroscience of American Indian Resilience and Risk, and our partners at Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Health, and of course the Shawnee tribe for all of their efforts. We're very grateful. And so that's the last of the presentation. Hopefully I didn't take up too much time, but I'm happy to field any questions or thoughts that you all may have.
I thought that was just really an example of brilliance. And, you know, Evan, I've always said that, Native people genetically were scientists before there was a field of science, right? Astronomers before there was a field of astronomy. And so that science history from a native way has always been there. And I think this is really, I'm very intrigued by this topic, and I'd like to hear more about it because I think when we're working in and everybody on the call now work in some way in behavioral health or substance use prevention or treatment. But I think if we no pun intended, but drill down to actually what's happening in one's brain and how that culture is a buffer, and you can see it in your study as a preventive tool for substance use, or you can visually see the cultural engagement lighting up brain function. I just think that's a whole different element of substance use treatment in that example. And I think it is not, well, at least providers that I know are so busy, working with the human in front of them or the community and putting out fires. It's really hard to kind of back up and think how the role of brain science and neuroscience in substance use or substance not use. And I just think this is really fabulous, and I can't thank you enough. And timing was perfect. Of course, there is no problem with that. So let me just turn it. I think we're going over to Livia now.
Yes, thank you so much. I am looking at the chat, and Evan, I don't see any specific questions, but I sure see a lot of kudos and, folks thinking this is a hopeful, interesting, fascinating presentation. And we do have one question around handouts. And handouts, really, if you're thinking about the PowerPoint, is something that we will send out to everyone afterwards. I know Lee will be responding to that. So we have a lot of thank yous, and I think folks are looking forward to hearing kind of next steps. There's one private PM coming in. So someone is asking, is there a big long-term goal in how this information from the study will be used once it's finalized?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the big long-term goal is really non-specific. The big long-term goal actually kind of goes to Holly's point earlier. This idea that Native people have had sciences before we use the English words to describe science, let's say. And so what I really view the big long-term goal of this type of work is really, it's not that we are establishing the evidence that culture is beneficial. We don't need the neuroscience and clinical science to have that. The resilience and cultural continuity in and of itself represents the I guess community defined, culturally congruent evidence base, for that being engaged with our traditional culture is beneficial for well-being. Oftentimes that is the purpose of all of our traditional circles, right? Is this how you live a good life, how you are a good family member, a tribal community member, how we keep ourselves healthy, our families healthy, our communities healthy. That information is embedded in these cultural practices. The large long-term goal of this work is really to almost provide a translational space for the bits that are appropriate, for the things that are relevant to be shared in a modern healthcare context. Is how do we empower that cultural infrastructure to be honored in modern approaches to treating, in my case, mental health conditions and substance use conditions, although there are people in health research doing this in all sorts of ways, by providing a scientific evidence base that translates this cultural information in a way that's appropriate to a scientific and healthcare environment that distributes resources and sets funding priorities and sets practice information for how we best promote people's health and wellness. That's kind of what I would consider the big long-term kind of umbrella goal. In the short term, what that looks like is identifying the best candidates for intervention and prevention programming, and in this case for substance use disorders, that are relevant to specific communities and culturally congruent. So oftentimes what ends up happening is the healthcare systems that are treating and for Native people are often under-resourced and oversubscribed. So a lot of our work ends up just being, how do we get people access to care, that kind of putting out fires approach that Holly was talking about. But what I know as a clinical psychologist in the broader field of things is that even in the most resourced systems where people do get the quote unquote best care possible, our best evidence-based practices are only effective about 60 to 70% of the time. And for those people, they're often suffering again within 12 months. And by often, I mean about half of those folks. So even if we're able to get the access to care, we still have a long ways to go in terms of understanding what is the best way to help people recover from or stay away from substance use disorders and other mental health conditions. And from my perspective, Native people deserve a voice in that arena. We deserve a seat at that table in developing the modern approaches to this, and it should be something that honors our cultural roots. And so that's hopefully that's not too rambly of a description of this type of work.
No, that was perfect.
That was perfect. Thank you. And just when do you expect this phase of the study to be completed? Is just the last question from Dr. Brown, and then we'll turn it over to you, Holly.
Well, so the AIMS study is published, so that's we anytime we're doing this, I always try to write in the ability to pay for open access fees so that communities can access the direct information if they want. So that study, the AIMS study, is open access. I'm happy to share that link with anyone that wants it. My email's in the chat now. For the Shawnee Tribe project, we're right in the middle of a 5-year project, so we're expecting, a couple of years yet before we're really done with that initial process, and then the community engaged interpretation and dissemination is really honored. So that may take another significant chunk of time, 6 months or a year, to really round out the community involvement at the late stage before we're ready to disseminate beyond, because I really want to honor that information is coming from a particular tribe, and they should have access first and decide where it goes from there and how. So that's kind of where we're at in that process. And there was a question about handouts. Of course, the slides are available, but we do have informational handouts that are just more kind of infographic style things. If those kinds of things are of interest to anyone, please email me. I'm happy to share electronic versions, or I can even mail you hard copies if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Free of charge, of course.
The other thought I had, Livia, is I have a personal belief that every Native person is brilliant. Even the people that are suffering from poor health or poverty or substance use, that they are as brilliant as any of us on the call. We just may have had more access to resources and access to education, or but I believe everyone has brilliant genes genetically. And I was just thinking, and I like the way you described that goofy hat uh, as one way that you use to track brain activity. But I think even people that are in treatment, every one of them is smart enough, if they had an explanation of brain function as part of substance use. And I know that some of you on the call actually do that in your treatment approach, but they can get it. They can understand it. It helps them move away from the shame and guilt kind of stuck mode that many people are in. So I just think there's a lot of hope and interest in the native neuroscience. And thank you so much for sharing this information. And I think you're stimulating a lot of thinking. And so we will follow up. We, the reclaiming team, will follow up and send out your PowerPoint with your email information as well. So that was my thought about the patients have brilliance too. And I think that this is all a fascinating topic. So thank you, Livia. Bernice, this is your slide.
Hi, yes. So Lee just put in the chat the link to the evaluation, and also the QR code is on this slide. So you can get any of these certificates if you complete the survey. So I just brought it up and it is on the link. So certificate of completion, certificate of continuing medical education, certificate of continuing nursing, certificate of counseling, and social work certificate. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, Holly, or Haley Abila. Haley Abila is actually at Cardia, and she is the person that generates and gets those out to you guys. Next slide. There you go, Holly.
So next month, Dr. Jackie and I are going to co-present some information. We do not have a title yet. All of you all that send in topics you're interested in hearing about, we see every one of those. So Dr. Vorpal and I, who is another tribal psychologist, we're going to be looking at the requests of topics that you all have submitted and what we do next month, same time, same place, same link. We will be addressing one of your topics, and we'll also send out something. The reclaiming team will send out something to give you the specific topic for next month, but it will be myself and Dr. Jackie Vorpal. So next slide. So I don't know, Evan, if you want to say something about the video we're going to see, but we always close with a video, and I'm really happy to see this one that Dr. White selected personally.
Yeah, I'll just share. This is a video from a stomp dance, a very informal social gathering that we host every year in our tribal partnership with the Shawnee tribe, where we provide community updates, what we're up to, how we're going. We provide any information, but more importantly, we create this as a community gathering space, share a meal, and some dancing together. So I hope you enjoy this clip from that event this past year.
I love listening to a stomp dance. Thank you, Evan. That was fabulous. Thank you so much. It was really, really fabulous presentation.
Anyway.
See you all next time.